Let's talk about artists. I just talked a little bit about art in the fandom. Let's talk more about artists. Because one of the things that makes the furry fandom so unique is how participatory it is, right? It's not, we don't just sit back and passively consume furry media, let it get thrown at our face. We take part in it. Right? As it turns out, there are thousands of content creators in the furry fandom. It's very different from something like, say, the Harry Potter fandom, where one person, J.K. Rowling, gets to decide what counts and doesn't count as canon in the Harry Potter fandom. No one person gets to decide what counts and doesn't count as furry, right? Everyone just kind of contributes their own unique contribution, whether it's through a persona, whether it's through a unique species you created, whether it's through stories, whether it's through art. And so what you find is that there's thousands of these creators, and a lot of us in this room engage in this content creation. 38% of furries consider themselves some sort of visual artists. We're not all, selling that artwork, but many of us try our hand at it at one point or another. Likewise, almost 1/3 of the people in this room engage in some kind of writing, right? Again, not everyone's a Kyle Gold, not everyone makes the majority of their income through selling works of fiction, but many of us write occasionally. Musicians, 17% of those in this room, statistically, are musicians, right? We perform, we create music, we write music, we play instruments. And 8% of us, God help us, are YouTubers. We spend time on the internet. In fact, there are so many content creators, we tried to get a big list, a comprehensive list of people's favorite content creators. The list was over 1,000 unique entries. So you're seeing just like the top, 100 or so here. Somehow I made the list. As a content creator, I do science, but I was like 150 or something, humble brag. But yeah, so you can see that some of these are names you probably recognize. This is all over the world, so certainly you'll see names you don't recognize if you're not from that region. And what you see as well is that we have a weird mix of folks. We have musicians, we have writers, we have visual artists, we have YouTubers, we have storytellers, we have scientists apparently on this list. We've actually studied artists in particular as well. We've gotten together focus groups and panels and did surveys of artists in the fandom, self-identified artists. And as it turns out, women are more likely to be artists in the fandom than men are. Not a huge, overwhelming difference, but enough to be statistically significant. We also found that transgender people in the fandom, gender non-conforming people, tend to be more likely to be artists in the fandom. In fact, almost 1 in 5 artists in the fandom identify as such. Furries are really bad at guessing the gender of the artist. We did an experiment, if you were here a few years ago, we actually did an experiment where we threw art on the screen and asked people, try to guess the gender of the person who made this. You might as well be rolling a die, flipping a coin for how accurate, actually that would have made you more accurate than furries actually were. Furries are terrible at trying to guess the gender of the artist just based on their artwork. It was a really neat hypothesis though, submitted to us by a furry. Right, so at these panels, someone had asked us that question, and we tested it. And so we get a lot of our best ideas from the fandom itself. Many of the artists in the fandom were artists before they were furries. And so many of these folks were artists long before they joined the furry fandom. It wasn't the case that they joined the fandom and were inspired to become artists. And so they've been artists long before that. Furry artists tend to congregate together. Chances are if you're a furry artist, statistically about half of your friends are also artists, so they spend time with people who share their interests. We also find, again, contrary to some of the misconceptions, that only about 18% of artists would describe their artwork as predominantly erotic in nature. We're going to talk more about that later, but just teasing with that idea for now. What do furries spend money on? Right? This is important for people who want to sell to furries. Fursuits are certainly some of the most iconic and expensive parts of furry spending, but they're not everything, right? As it turns out, some of the most popular items in the fandom are things like tails. Almost half of the furries out there own a tail of some sort. About 1 in 3 own a collar, own some kind of furry clothing. Ears are popular, paws are popular, wings if you have wings, I guess they're popular. Not so popular if you don't, I guess. But furries spend a lot of time purchasing furry-themed stuff. Right? They spend money on their hobbies, just like people with any other hobby. This is sort of a breakdown. The blue bars are how much furries actually spent on their interest in the past year. The red bars are how much you would spend if you could. Right? So, in the past year, we find that furries spend about 3 times as much on digital art as on physical art. So furries actually spend a lot of cash purchasing digital artwork. We find that erotic artwork only makes up about a third to a quarter of furries' spending on commissions. We find that furries spend about $50 a year on Patreon or other direct-to-artist support sites like that. What is this? Oh, I was going to make a joke about your character here's, but we find that this spending on artwork directly, though, is just a fraction of some of the other spending that furries do. Furries spend a tremendous amount of money going to conventions. Imagine that. They go to conventions. They spend almost $600 a year on average attending conventions. They spend a lot of money on other things as well. Paraphernalia can be everything from action figures to plushes to fursuits. Fursuits gets lumped into there. You name it. Furries spend a lot of money on this fandom. And in fact, you can compare furries to other fandoms. So the red bars here are how much furries spend on this content. The blue bars are how much anime fans spend. Furries completely outspend the anime fans here. I feel a small twinge of pride, and I feel like financial investors crying a little bit at this slide. We can also compare this, by the way, for perspective. The Brony fans and My Little Pony fans have, on average, a collection of about $1,000 worth of merchandise. We're going to look at those numbers in the next year or so for furries, how much your collection of furry stuff is worth, so we'll be able to compare that meaningfully as well. And for the record, for the convention runners here, breakdowns of self-reported convention, what rank are you at? We find that about 70% of furries are attendees. We find about 20% are sponsors, 10% are super sponsors, and about 5% of the lovely folks you see running around are staffers at any given con. Let's give them a round of applause, by the way. Okay, so what else do furries do? As it turns out, quite a bit. We don't just sit around and look at media. We can look at these different overlaps and subgroups within the furry fandom. About 2/3 of furries are gamers. About half of furries are science fiction fans. Not surprising when you consider that many of the roots of the furry fandom as it exists today has its origins in the science fiction fandom. We see fantasy fans in there. We see bronies in there, writers, musicians. Across the board, you see furries of all shapes and sizes, furries of all sorts of interests congregating here in this wonderful fandom of ours. This was a random question that we got asked. What kinds of music and media do furries like? As it turns out, furries really like their rock, their electronica, their alternative music. You see this a lot in art too, a lot of electronica and rave scenes. Furries like their rock music. That's Night in the Woods and Agretsuko together at last. Furries also tend to, when it comes to television, like, not surprisingly, science fiction, cartoons, comedies, fantasies. Not a lot of furry reality shows or furry news and politics. But furries tend to like very predictable sorts of media. If this is what they're fans of, these walking, talking animal cartoons and characters, lo and behold, you're seeing that in the kind of media they consume. So that's sort of what furries like in a nutshell.